Gender and sexuality in the Renaissance and early modern periods have long been examined by historians. Indeed, 19th century historians in particular did much to solidify understandings of Renaissance gender, and their thinking shaped historiography up until the late 20th century. The Renaissance was understood to be a time of refinement, grace, elegance, and learning, as was reflected in the writing and art of the time. Men, and especially elite men, demonstrated Renaissance masculinity through their skill, bravado, and nonchalance, while women were praised for their beauty, manners, and grace. From the 1970s, however, spurred on by the sexual and feminist revolutions taking place, historians began to ask new, more nuanced questions about these ideals and how much of an impact they had on the daily lives of real people. How was sexuality within a marriage defined? What were the Renaissance understandings of homosexuality? How is the human body understood? Today, historians are increasingly adopting an interdisciplinary approach and are examining the ways in which two or more spheres of thought intersected in relation to gender, sexuality, and the body. For example, how did medical studies in relation to art practices shape how Renaissance individuals understood masculinity and femininity? By adopting a multi-purpose perspectival approach to examining gender in the Renaissance, historians are able to get a broader and fuller picture of how gender and sexuality was understood in the past. In my own research at Cambridge, I look at the relationship that early modern women had with their bodies and their clothing, and how these interactions materialized gender. Notions of gender and sexuality are inexorably tied to culturally and socially influenced interpretations of the physical body. As such, today I'm going to focus on the ways in which the human body was interpreted in early modern Europe and outline some of the questions and issues this raises for the modern historian. We must ask what a body meant to a Renaissance person. How did they conceptualize and understand the workings of the body? Following from this, how did these bodily workings then shape notions of gender and sexuality? I will then touch upon some of the external factors that were present in Renaissance life that also had a profound impact on how gender and sexual norms were established and maintained. To start, we must explore how the body was seen to function biologically. Understandings of the body in the Renaissance and early modern period were most prominently based on humoral theory. This was a way of understanding the body as well as psychological and emotional constitutions. Humoralism was developed by a classical Greek physician, Hippocrates, and was still prevalent in the early modern period. According to Hippocrates, the human body was made up of four substances: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. These substances circulated around the body, and everything from one's health to one's character, external appearance, and sex were determined by the balance of the humors. In today's world, it is generally accepted that sex, that is, the biological traits that indicate whether you are male or female, is distinct from gender, which is the behavioral, cultural, and psychological traits that are associated with your sex. Importantly, these conceptions of a sex-gender distinction did not exist in early modern Europe. Rather, gendered or nurtured traits were considered inherent to a person's sex. That is to say, you were a man or a woman because you behaved and presented yourself as a man or a woman. Men and women both had humors flowing through their bodies, but it was believed that they circulated in different ways, which was how women were women and men were men. Men's bodies were seen to be perfect in form and ideal in constitution. They were hot and dry, which was the ideal constitution, with more blood and yellow bile. Women's bodies were cold and wet, an undesirable constitution with more black bile and phlegm. The feminine body represented the incomplete and imperfect, in contrast to the complete and perfect masculine body. Because of their humoral makeup, women were seen to be inferior to men. Men's bodily constitutions allowed them to be rational and active. Women, on the other hand, were considered to be more irrational and passive. Moreover, understandings of the reproductive systems of men and women played a significant role in this hierarchy of the sexes. With sufficient internal heat, the penis and testes could descend from inside the body. Women were believed to have organs that were identical to men's organs. However, without the necessary internal heat, their reproductive systems did not descend but stayed incomplete and imperfect inside the body. Humors also influenced external appearances. This illustration demonstrates the physical traits that were believed to be associated with different humors. Furthermore, men were thought to have darker skin because of their body's internal heat. Women had paler skin as they lacked this inner heat. Of course, this standard of paleness was also tied up in notions of ideal beauty, especially for women. Interestingly, in Renaissance art, artists also followed these conventions. When shown together, women are more often than not paler than their male counterparts. Notions of gender and sexuality were also intrinsically tied to religious understandings of male and female bodies and behaviors. Christian beliefs generally suppressed sexual desire and promoted intercourse solely for procreation. Modesty in behavior and appearance were also highly valued for men and women alike. Behaving and presenting oneself in the modest manner expected of one's sex reflected one's inner virtues. The more virtuous the individual, the more likely they were to have a clear path to salvation. As such, gendered behaviors and practices had a decisive hand in the ascension of one's soul to heaven. Biblical texts were also important to the shaping of masculinity and femininity. In the Bible, God makes Adam out of clay, molding him in God's image. Eve was then made from one of Adam's ribs and was thus one step removed from being created directly in God's image. Moreover, Eve was responsible for taking an apple from the tree of knowledge and catalyzing the fall of man. As such, women were associated with a lack of mental fortitude, sin, and in particular sins of the flesh. On the other hand, the Bible also provided another model for feminine behavior in the Virgin Mary. In many ways, Mary was understood as Eve's opposite. She was virtuous, chaste, and humble. Mary represented an ideal to which women could aspire but could never fully reach. To a great extent, notions of ideal femininity were defined by women's interactions and relationships with men. A woman was to be an obedient daughter and then a wife. She bore children, preferably male, to continue lineages. She was polite, mannered, beautiful to look at, and charming in conversation. Women were associated with the home and domestic work, and thus often led much more secluded lives than those of their male counterparts. Conversely, men operated in the outside world, engaging in business, politics, and public life more broadly. The ideal man demonstrated his masculinity in ways that alluded to his mental capacities, physical prowess, and virility. He provided for his household, was active in the world, and had a strong bloodline. It is important to note, however, that what I've just detailed was the ideal for men and women, as set out in contemporaneous literature, art, and philosophy. One of the things historians find interesting to explore is the split between ideals and expectations and how men and women actually operated in daily life. Indeed, this will be a topic that I hope we discuss further in our live Zoom session. Similarly, I want for you to think about the ways in which gender and sexuality may have been materialized through things. Historians argue that during the Renaissance and early modern periods, objects played a crucial role in the construction and performance of gendered behavior. Some of these objects were worn or held on the body, like lace handkerchiefs, pearl earrings, swords, or armor. Some were involved in gendered grooming practices, like face powders or rouge. Now, I imagine that as I was listing these objects, you were associating them with either men or women. One of the most interesting things about Renaissance gender performance is that it was very different to today's standards. Men often wore pearl earrings and carried lace handkerchiefs, and women often wore garments that resembled armor in cut and construction. By studying these objects and representations of men and women engaging with these objects, historians can begin to untangle how people in the Renaissance experienced their gender and sexualities. Moreover, material culture can help us understand Renaissance notions of sexuality. The rise of the nude figure in Renaissance art is an interesting point of focus. What happened socially and culturally in the years around 1400 that allowed for the nude figure to become such an important part of the cultural landscape? Furthermore, how did an increase in representation of the nude impact people's understandings of their own bodies, genders, and sexualities? Our other speaker, Ella, will be exploring some of these issues in a bit more depth, so I'm going to stop there and pass things on to her. And I'd just like to say I'm really looking forward to exploring and trying to answer some of these questions with you all in our live session. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Ella and I'm a first year PhD student at the University of Cambridge. I'm going to be talking to you guys today about gender and sexuality in the long 18th century, which spans the years of about 1650 to 1850, so pretty long. I have only really ever worked on Anglophone history, so that's the history of English-speaking countries. So you're going to have to pardon me for the Anglocentrism, i.e. the focus on England, of this particular talk. So I'm going to first pick up on a few things that Anna talked about, mainly by discussing two major historical narratives that historians have used to explain change over this very long period. I'm then going to delve a little bit deeper into something Anna was discussing right at the end of her talk, which is basically the notion of contrasting cultural expectations and norms with lived historical reality. Within that, I'm going to discuss very quickly a few different things, namely female sexuality, homosexuality, and lesbianism. So, firstly, to discuss two major narratives that historians have to explain change over this period. The first is the idea of a shift from a one-sex to a two-sex body. What does this mean? Well, I don't know if you remember, but Anna was talking about the fact that before around 1700 or so, there was the idea that there was a one-sex conception of sexual difference. What this means was that women and their sexual organs, in particular, women's sexual organs, were supposedly the internal, imperfect inverse of male sexual organs. So something like the vaginal tunnel was supposedly the inverse inside of the penis, as you can see in this picture, which is supposedly of a vagina, of internal female anatomy, but as you might see, it looks quite like a penis. In line with this, there are actually stories in this period of women who were originally women suddenly becoming internally warmer and a penis popping out of their body where it hadn't been there before, and then becoming men. However, as the argument goes, after around 1700, there's a shift from this one-sex conception of sexual difference to a two-sex conception. So the idea now that men and women are completely different, their sexual organs are not the inverse or reverse of each other, but they are completely separate and always have been and always will be, i.e. you can't shift from one to the other. This idea was put forward by an American historian, very influential, called Thomas Laqueur, around 30 years ago, and it's been really, really important. However, more recently, some historians have really taken it to task and really argued against it. One in particular, a classical historian called Helen King, wrote a whole book in which she criticised Laqueur's argument and argued that even in the ancient classical period, in Roman and Greek medical sources, there is a conception of two-sex sexual difference. So, as you can tell, historians don't necessarily agree on these complex issues, and there are so many debates about the nature of gendered bodies in this period. Now, to the second narrative. And this is a narrative put forward by a historian called Faramez Dabhawala in 2012. It's basically an argument about changes in sexual freedom, but also changes in the conception of male and female sexualities. His argument goes that in the 17th century, women are seen as the more lustful and more voracious sex, so they're more active in their sexuality, whereas men are seen as less so. However, he argues that over the next 150 years, there's a complete role reversal, and men become to be seen as more lustful and more voracious, and women are seen as more passive in their sexuality, and men are more clearly seen as sexual predators and sexual aggressors. He also argues that over this period, sex begins to be seen as less taboo, particularly non-marital sex, and he argues that it's also important to police people's individual sexual practices, whatever's going on in their bedroom. Historians have, however, noted the supposed phallocentrism of this argument, so the idea that it focuses on men and male sexualities, and historians have said that women's sexuality in particular is still severely policed well into the 19th century and beyond. So I'm now going to talk about the issue of cultural norms versus experiences, and that's what I'm going to focus on for the rest of this talk. So it's really difficult to access people's real sexual experiences in this period because it was considered indecent to write about them, basically. However, in the material that we do have, I think it's quite clear that people's real sexual lives can be so different from what's being talked about or preached in moral, religious, legal, and even literary texts. So, for example, while some sources in the 18th century depicted women as sexually passive and preached that they should be so, if you look at women's writings, you can often see that this isn't the case. For example, there's a woman called Elizabeth Wortley Montagu, who in the 1730s was a middle-aged woman who pursued an affair with a much younger man with whom she exchanged secret letters. In these letters, and I'm going to quote, she basically talks of her passion for her lover, and she writes of an impetuous fire which invaded her whole soul, exclaiming it was more than madness, and also sent him an erotic poem. Hester Thrale Piozzi, who's also in the 1780s, a middle-aged woman, wrote about the strength of my passion, again I'm quoting, for her new husband, and said it would be a fantastic delight to be impregnated by him. So what went on in people's bedrooms and in people's minds was potentially quite different from what was being preached at the pulpit. In line with this, I also want to think about the reality of male homosexual experiences in this period. As you might know, male homosexual acts, often referred to as sodomy if they included oral or anal penetration, were illegal and were punishable by death by hanging. There were many negative depictions of male homosexuality in this period. For example, even in the very pornographic novel Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure, which was published in 1750, which basically details the life of a prostitute and is extremely pornographic, there's a male homosexual act depicted, and it's depicted as really, really disgusting and perverse, even to this prostitute who's doing lots of erotic things with lots of different people. However, gay men did of course exist in this period, and they found ways of expressing and enjoying their sexuality in spaces that were outside of the eyes of mainstream society, essentially. Gay men could visit special places called molly houses, of which we have quite a lot of descriptions, because the state essentially sent out spies to try to shut these places down and convict people of sodomy. We have one description in particular from the 1720s, where a spy writes of Mother Clapp's Molly House, which was really famous. I'm going to quote here, that he found near 50 men there, making love to one another, as they called it. Sometimes they'd sit in one another's laps, use their hands indecently, dance and make curtsies, and mimic the language of women. In these spaces, there are loads of descriptions of transvesticism and of gay men enacting mock marriages and mock births, interestingly. Gay men could also use special languages, basically body languages, as codes for highlighting their sexuality to other men. So they could go to parks, particularly in London, to pick up other sexual partners using these sorts of codes. Lesbian acts were not and never have been illegal in Britain. And lesbians, who were also called tribades in the 18th century, were nowhere near as vilified as male homosexuals. However, their preferences and their practices were still considered unnatural and unacceptable. However, again, they did exist. I don't know if any of you have seen the BBC drama called Gentleman Jack, which basically details the life of a lesbian woman called Anne Lister, who lived in Halifax in the north of the country. in the late 18th and early 19th century. We know about her because she left a diary, about a sixth of which is in code. And when the code was cracked in the 1930s, it was basically shown to reveal that she was engaging in sexual acts with other women. Lister was solely attracted to women, and she wrote in 1821, and I'm going to quote here, "I love and only love the fairer sex, and thus beloved by them in turn, my heart revolts from any love but theirs." She engaged in many sexual relationships with multiple women, and even ends up having a secret marriage to the love of her life, a woman called Anne Walker. This raises the issue of intersectionality, which is basically the idea that people's experience of oppression or discrimination is informed by multiple overlaying factors such as gender, sexuality, wealth, and race. So, although Anne experienced some forms of oppression because of her wealth, her status, and her white privilege, she didn't experience half as much oppression as other people who had the same sexuality as hers. So that was a very quick whistle-stop tour. I hope you enjoyed it.